This is going to probably come out a little late, but happy birthday, Zoro. With that being said, no, that was not clickbait. I actually think Dracula Mihawk will never fight Roanoa Zoro for the title of World's Strongest Swordsman. However, I do think Zoro will fight a Mihawk for that title, that character being S-Hawk. With that being said, we're going to front load the video a little bit with how I think S-Hawk is more narratively important for Zoro than Dracula Mihawk is, but a little later we're going to go into why I think Dracula Mihawk is going off on a totally different path from what he was set forward to do originally, at least by what the story tells us. With that being said, S-Hawk is less of a individual character, or at least at this point he is, and more of a representative of Zoro's journey throughout the story of One Piece. Because breaking down what S-Hawk is and what S-Hawk has at his disposal for a combat ability is something that a Zoro opponent has had in the past in one form or another. With that being said, let's break down what S-Hawk has at his disposal. 1, he is a Seraphim, which means he is most likely a sky person, and flames appear on his back that govern his speed and durability. On top of that, he is a pacifista, and being a pacifista, he is a cyborg of some sort and has the ability to shoot out Kizaru lasers from his hands. And he is a devil fruit user, even though the devil fruit is technically artificial through the use of green blood. He has the abilities of the dice fruit, which now belongs to Das Bones, otherwise known as Mr. One, whom was one of the most significant opponents for Zoro. And lastly, he is a clone of Dracula Mihawk and has a weird makeshift Yoru that he carries around. We don't know how significant the Yoru copy will be, but because he is a clone of Dracula Mihawk, he prioritizes swordsmanship above all else, presumably. With that being said, there's some very interesting notes to make. 1, the first opponent that Zoro fights in the story in a one-on-one confrontation is Kabaji. Kabaji had the ability to breathe fire, and he used his body as a sheath because he was a sword swallower, right? Well, S-Hawk literally becomes a sword due to the abilities of the dice fruit and has flames on his back. So we have a fire and sword relationship there. Instead of swallowing a sword, S-Hawk is a sword. Instead of spitting fire, S-Hawk literally has a fire on his back going almost at all times. Continuing. But if you want to take things back to even before the Bucky Pirates, Axe Hand Morgan literally has an axe for a hand, and being the user of an artificial dice fruit, S-Hawk can turn any part of his body into a blade. So easy comparison there. Moving forward, we have the Nanban brothers and Captain Kuro, all who use cat claws as weapons and high-speed movement, which are things both available literally to S-Hawk, because we see him turn his hands into the same sort of bladed fingers that Mr. One was capable of in the anime when S-Hawk shows up. So it's very on brand to say anything Mr. One can do, S-Hawk can also do, because they have the same abilities. Moving on, though, we have Mihawk. Well, S-Hawk compares because, of course, S-Hawk literally is a clone of Mihawk. No brainer there. Moving on. Hachi, the fishman who used the six-sword style, is comparable to S-Hawk because 1, he's a different race, meaning he's not human, and 2, he uses multiple blades like Hachi, except instead of using 6 individual blades, S-Hawk is more of like a Swiss Army knife in which he is all the blades, as he can turn any part of his body into a blade. Then we come down to Mr. One. Easy, no-brainer. S-Hawk literally has the same devil fruit as Mr. One. they compare very easily. Now, when we get into the opponents that Zoro fights on Skypiea, some very interesting things can be gleaned from Ohm and Braham. Braham used a weapon called flash guns. Flash guns were just two twin barrel guns that had flash dials installed in them. So Braham would blind the opponent before he shot, and the opponent doesn't know where the bullet is coming from. Then we have Ohm. Ohm was one of NL's flunkies that used something called an Isen dial at the base of his sword, which delivered a constant stream of iron cloud that he could shape. He usually shaped it in the form of a blade, but sometimes it could become a whip or a big block wall. So, how do these two relate back to S-Hawk? Well, both of them are, first of all, sky people. Braham is a Shandurian, and Ohm is a Birkin, while S-Hawk is a Lunarian. We don't know quite yet what the relationship is between Lunarians and the other three flavors of Sky Person, but it could be gleamed that they are related. You don't get to be that similar without being related. That's just my opinion. However, being a pacifista, S-Hawk doesn't just blind the opponent with light. He shoots an actual laser from his hands. So in that way, he's a bit of an upgrade from Braham. And then again, he has the dice fruit. So while Ohm has a iron blade that can change shape at will, literally S-Hawk is a blade that can change shape at will because of the dice fruit. He can spawn blades all over himself. He is a blade. Now, moving into the Davy backfight, there's something pretty interesting to be gleaned here as well. When fighting the Foxy Pirates with Sanji in the Davy backfight, he and Sanji fight Pickle, Hamburg, and Big Pan. The reason why these three, in a way, compare to S-Hawk is, one, all of them are abnormally large, like S-Hawk, and all of them use steel weapons, like S-Hawk. And one of them, being Big Pan, is of a mixed race, as he is a wonton, which is a fishman mixed with a giant. In that way, S-Hawk compares to him as well, because he is of a mixed race in a way. He is a clone of a human with the DNA of a Seraphim. So he too is a mixed race being, along with being a cyborg. So, with that being said, that's how the three Foxy Pirates compare to S-Hawk. They use their size and steel weapons to try to get a foothold over Sanji and Zoro, and that is what S-Hawk has at his disposal as well. Size and a variety of steel weapons, not just this dice fruit, but his makeshift Yoru. So in that way, they compare. And like Big Pan, who used his slimy skin to his advantage at one point, S-Hawk also uses a racial advantage to his favor as well, in being a Lunarian and having increased durability and speed due to whether or not the flame on his back is lit. So when we get into opponents Zoro fights during the dual arcs of Water 7/Enies Lobby, there are two significant characters that are pretty similar to one another, those being T-Bone and Kaku. Both of them are associated with the world government, and both of them are known for their strange flying slash attacks. Kaku with his supposed expertise in Tempest Kick, and T-Bone using his long sword Bamboo is able to make a lot of very strange and very mobile flying slash attacks. These two are comparable to S-Hawk because S-Hawk 2 works for the world government as they funded his birth, and 2, S-Hawk, in being a user of the dice fruit and a clone of Dracula Mihawk, is an expert at using flying slash attacks, as he can kick them even by turning his leg into a sword, very similarly to what Kaku does. And like Kaku as well, who has the ox fruit model giraffe and used his unique physiology to fight, Kaku is matched with S-Hawk in doing the same thing, as S-Hawk in being a Lunarian and having the Dice fruit can too use his unique physiology to his advantage in terms of defenses in a fight. But moving on, when it comes to Ryuma and Kuma, sadly, based on what we know about Kuma now, they're more alike than we realize, but they both do compare very nicely to S-Hawk, because Ryuma is a zombie slave. His body was grave robbed from his country of Wano, and then he was implanted with the Shadow of Brook, turning him into a zombie general for Moria's private militia. Kuma is also a part of a private militia owned by the world government, as he was the genesis for the Pacifista Project, giving birth to many a clone of himself and further clones of other characters, leading to S-Hawk's creation. So, in that way, Ryuma is a swordsman, much like S-Hawk is a swordsman. Ryuma is using the clone abilities of a swordsman in Brook, much like how S-Hawk is using the clone abilities of a swordsman in being a clone of Mihawk. And I guess in a way using the weird sword skill, but not really sword skill of Das Bones, Mr. One, if you want to say that, on top of any sword skill Albert might have had at the time, otherwise known as King, because when we see him leaving the lab with a young Kaido, he is holding a blade, so it's very likely that even at a young age, he had a caliber of swordsmanship. But to continue, and two, he is a slave to a authority device or authority implementation, because in being a zombie created through the factors of the shadow fruit, Ryuma cannot betray Gecko Moria. With that being said, S-Hawk is implanted with an authority chip, so he cannot betray the hierarchy set by the authority chip. In that way, Kuma is comparable, because even though it's not really known if Kuma himself has an authority chip in him, but his mind was wiped by Vegapunk, so he may be under the same principles as the rest of the pacifistas that look like him are. That's not really explained as far as I know. However, like Kuma, S-Hawk can shoot out lasers. He is a Devil Fruit user. He is of a different race, because Kuma is a rare race, which is a Buccaneer, and S-Hawk, in being a Lunarian, is to a rare race. And three, he is a Devil Fruit user, because S-Hawk has the abilities of the Dice fruit, and Kuma has the abilities of the Paw fruit. So in that way, both of them do compare quite nicely to one another, and S-Hawk also compares to Ryuma. Now, breaking into the new world, it has been recently discovered in a Vivicard drop that very oddly, S-Hawk, as well as the rest of the Seraphim at this moment in time that have been named, all have observation and armament hockey. So, therefore, any opponent that Zoro fights in the time skip at this point is compared to S-Hawk in terms of being a similar caliber of warrior, because they too most likely have observation and armament, as those are the two most common types, which then doubles back and makes him very comparable to Dracula Mihawk, because it was recently found out as well that he too only has observation and armament. But to continue, in Fishman Island, Zoro fights Hyozo. Hyozo is very comparable to S-Hawk because one, he is of a different race, and two, he uses multiple blades. He, unlike Hachi, uses the 8-sword style. But like Hachi, he is of a different race that's not human. So in the same ways, he compares to S-Hawk in the similar ways to how Hachi compared to S-Hawk, in being that they are swordsmen of a different race who use many blades. S-Hawk literally being a body of blades. Then we have Monet during Punk Hazard. Monet is a Devil Fruit user, even though she is a Logia, but how she compares to S-Hawk is that she is, one, a science experiment, and two, a winged person, because she has wings and other bird parts implanted on her person, due to the powers of the Op fruit. So she is a science experiment in that way. However, in being a winged person, S-Hawk also compares because he too got his wings through a science experiment, basically, even though his entire being is based off of gene splicing and whatnot. So in that way, they compare. They both got their wings through science experiments. Following her, we have Pika. Pika is a user of hockey. We know that. But two, he uses his stone fruit to his advantage as a means of defense. S-Hawk is very similar because much like, say, As Bones or even slightly Kaku, he uses his Devil Fruit defensively as well because the Dice Fruit makes you as hard as steel. So, in that way, he compares to Pika. But getting down into Wano, we have some very obvious ones, but some also very interesting ones. Killer, Hawkins, and King. How he compares to Hawkins is that he is a Devil Fruit user who is a swordsman who prioritizes using his Devil Fruit for defense. Similar principles apply to S-Hawk. Then when we get to Killer, Killer 2, again, is a Devil Fruit user, but is also a swordsman who prioritizes on speed most of the time. S-Hawk compares as well because when the fire is out, S-Hawk gets fast. And S-Hawk is a very complex swordsman because he has the Dice Fruit. With that being said, that brings us down to the big man Albert, otherwise known as King. And it should go out saying they are very comparable to one another because both of them are sword users, even though Albert doesn't clarify himself as a swordsman, which is now kind of funny when you think about it because S-Hawk is now composed of two swordsman, non-swordsman characters, and both being Albert and Das Bones. But then he also has the DNA of the currently well-known and renowned best swordsman in the world, Dracula Mihawk. So that's funny. He's got two non-swordsmen and one of the best swordsmen in his genetic makeup. I find that very funny, but very cool. And like Albert, he too is a Lunarian. And like Albert as well, he's a Devil Fruit using Lunarian because Albert has the Dragon Fruit model Petrodon, and S-Hawk has the artificial variant of the Dice Fruit. So yeah, they are pretty 1-to-1 on that front. The only difference really being the Devil Fruit type. One is a Zoan, the other is a clone of a Paramecia. So yeah, with that being said, I think this list is going to just continue because we don't know how much S-Hawk will improve over time or what abilities will be available to him. Because unlike, say, Das Bones in the past, Mihawk's DNA, I think, is going to be a great help to S-Hawk because now the Dice Fruit, for the first time, presumably, is in the possession of someone who's actually a master swordsman, or at least has the knowledge of a master swordsman. With that being said, too, going back to Ryuma, we don't know, I guess going back to Mihawk himself, we don't know what exactly makes a black blade, nor do we know if Yoru is actually Mihawk's black blade. We don't know if he made it black because in that way, Mihawk could compare to Zoro and he could have just picked up a black blade and is capable of using it, but is not responsible for turning it black. I think this could be the opening gambit to explain what exactly turns a sword completely black, because S-Hawk is in a very interesting position, more so than any other character in the narrative, which is why I think he's going to be more of a challenging and more appropriate opponent for Zoro than, say, Mihawk, because not only is he the representation of Zoro's entire journey, but he possibly is going to be the only person in the series whose Devil Fruit is going to coincide with his swordsmanship, his base moveset improving. Because I would think in order to awaken the Dice Fruit, one would have to know the blade expertly. But in knowing the blade expertly, you just improve yourself as a swordsman overall. So one goes in hand with the other. One does not distract from the other's moveset. So his adeptness with the dice fruit is only going to improve his swordsmanship overall. This may lead to him awakening the ability to turn his fake Yoru into a real Yoru and actually turning it black. That's what I'm getting at, because that to me makes more sense just based on the fact that we know Mr. One purposely was made to be not a true swordsman, but a martial artist that turns his body into a blade. And seeing as how Mr. One, even though he is still around in the story in the same faction as Mihawk, which is very funny, but I think the reason why both of them are now put to the side is because as Hawk is going to be, one, the fulfillment of Zoro fighting Mihawk, and two, to show off what the dice fruit can actually do when in appropriate hands. And now we know too, seeing as how he both has the defenses of the dice fruit, the defenses of being a Lunarian and armored Haki, the weakness of being cut by a move whose purpose is to cut through steel is not necessarily going to work on S-Hawk because of that Lunarian defense and because of that armored Haki. But to continue as to why I think Mihawk's position has changed, we're going to have to go down the entire path of Mihawk throughout the narrative up to this point. So to truncate things a little bit, and just touching on the cliff notes and what is felt at that time, when we first meet Mihawk, Mihawk is the first warlord that we encounter in the series. His presence, what he does, and how he's being presented very much so puts in the frame of the mind of the reader that warlords are these otherworldly entities that Luffy and the crew are going to fight in the future, if they have any hope of achieving their dreams, right? The fact that Mihawk can slice open a galleon with ease does put him on a higher pedestal than anything we will see in the East Blue from that point forward, giving him this otherworldly presence that will not be matched for the rest of the saga. So this does paint Mihawk in a very interesting and otherworldly light, even though it is not he who calls himself the greatest swordsman in the world, which I always found very interesting. It was Zeph. So that's odd, but I think this does go to show that a man doesn't have to speak about his own reputation. Others will do so for him, being like this real deal, this real otherworldly threat that Zoro will have to actually fight in the future, presumably. However, if he were to have stayed like this, there would be no doubt in my mind that Zoro would fight him in the future. The problem about this is that Mihawk does not stay like this. The fact of the matter is that once Luffy becomes a name in the world and actually procures a bounty for himself after the defeat of Arlong, we see Mihawk pull up to an island where the red-haired pirates are hanging out. And of course, the scene grows quiet. You think there's actually going to be a confrontation. The tension is thick in the air, right? And we know that Shanks is a bad dude. So, oh boy, what's going to happen? But it is at this point in which Mihawk stops being Zoro's goal. Why do I say that? Because at this point, we see that Mihawk can be a human. The fact that Mihawk is humanized in this moment by sharing drinks with Shanks in celebration of Luffy getting his first bounty tells you that there are more sides to Mihawk. He is not a personified goal for Zoro to simply beat to proclaim a title. Mihawk is a person. Mihawk is an individual. Mihawk is a human. Despite his inhuman presence that he does oddly keep throughout the rest of the time that we see him in the story, especially when we get into Marineford. It's actually nuts, right? And this is further explained through other material like One Piece fan letter. Like, people see him appropriately as this otherworldly pillar of strength. That's all true. But the fact that he has this softness, the fact that he has this humanity within him shows you that he's not just a simple goal, that he's a person with thoughts and feelings and hobbies and talents and likes outside of swordsmanship. This is compounded upon itself, of course, in grand fashion when we do start up the time skip, because we, one, see he has a home. He doesn't live on a coffin-shaped boat. He has a home. He lives in a luxurious castle. He collects wine. He has a yard full of house pets. Because what are the human drills but house pets? They're all just funny monkeys. They're literally funny monkeys that he keeps on the island. Well, because they're natives of the island, but still, the fact that these weird, funny things are even associated with him is an interesting and odd note. On top of that, the fact that he even trains Zoro because Zoro wants to be strong for someone other than himself shows you that Mihawk has this sort of kindness, this sort of depth that we didn't really know he had, which then further offsets him from being Zoro's final goal. Because as we see in Dressrosa in a flashback, Mihawk then takes up a mentoring role in giving Zoro challenges, saying that if you can't make your sword blackened with hockey, you can't have a drink. I'm giving you this challenge as a stern father figure so you have something to strive for, something to actually make you meet your goal so you can accomplish being stronger for the person that you hold dear, in this case, that being Luffy. Also, on the flip, the fact that he even tolerates someone like Perona on his island speaks volume about his character, because Perona is a funny baby. Perona is a comedy character with a comedy power. It's a very powerful ability, but it is a comedy power and is used as a big gag during the Thriller Bark arc. So the fact that he not only embraces Perona, but treats her as a roommate and has lived with her for 2 years and just tolerates her presence as something, I guess, warm and heartfelt. We even see them gardening with one another as they're looking over the Straw Hats' progress during a cover story, while the human mandrills are joining them wearing gardening hats. From that, you can see that no, all the things that we thought about Mihawk initially don't stick. He is just a guy, a regular guy like anybody else, which I think is very important. And what also makes me think that if you're going to paint someone out to be this alien-like goal that needs to be knocked down, you wouldn't then paint him further in a humanizing light by giving him pets, by giving him hobbies, by giving him a funny little roommate whom he likes to spend time with. It doesn't really make a lot of sense. And then we get to the Yonko saga, in which the Straw Hat crew are now a Yonko crew, and I think this is where the story beat for Mihawk moving forward is being alluded to, or is right out revealed, because we learn that Mihawk now has joined Buggy in being a figurehead of the new Cross Guild organization, which is now a fellow Yonko organization akin with Straw Hats, right? The funny thing about this is that Mihawk joins Cross Guild on the premise of Crocodile appealing to their dual, personality of not being very trustful, which I think then opens up the door for them to further open up in the future by trusting Buggy, by Buggy instilling within them or restoring within them the romance of adventure by proclaiming that he wants the One Piece. I think while Zoro's journey is to become the world's strongest swordsman, he has always had something that Mihawk has either lost or at least was severely lacking in. And that is having Nakama around him, having some people around him that he can protect and then who can protect him, or at least people that he can trust in. And I think that's what is going down in Cross Guild. I think as we move forward in the story, we're going to see a lot of these characters start to soften up to one another and become comrades, become family, much like how the Straw Hats have become family despite their various differences that got them there in the first place. So with that being said, I do think that is going to be Mihawk's goal now, to become a good comrade, to become a good family member to the people in Cross Guild. Whereas Zoro, on the flip, is to become the world's strongest swordsman, as he has a great support system already in the Straw Hat crew. I think, too, this is going to lead to Mihawk having a very similar, I guess you can say, moment to Zoro. When Mihawk defeats Zoro back on the Baratier, Zoro proclaims that he will become the world's strongest swordsman, which will be fitting of the Pirate King. And I believe in other situations, Zoro has proclaimed that Luffy will be the Pirate King. I think Mihawk is going to have a similar situation in which he proclaims that there is no other result but for Buggy to be the Pirate King, or something of that effect. Like, he will believe in Buggy or proclaim that Buggy should be the Pirate King, even though he himself does not care about titles. There is no one more deserving than Buggy when it comes to being the Pirate King. That's what I think will happen, because a funny thing is mentioned in Marineford that Mihawk notices. He notices that Luffy can make allies out of anyone, and this isn't just some cheap Delphi trick. But what he fails to realize is that he most likely has been caught up in the same pace that Luffy exudes, because now he, through very odd circumstances, is now in a pirate crew under someone who calls himself Buggy the Clown, because Buggy has the same charisma as Luffy and can make allies out of anyone. This is shown even as far back as Buggy's first defeat, because former arc antagonist Alvida joins him firstly when he's trying to rebuild himself after his initial defeat. So he's always had a tendency to accrue allies from strange places. With that being said, let's go back to S-Hawk. The interesting thing about S-Hawk, turning things back over to him, is that unlike Mihawk, he has not been humanized. He has not been given hobbies. He has not been given funny cartoon buddies to pal around with. So, with that being said, it is S-Hawk who retains this sort of weird alien status of being a goal, whereas Mihawk is more of a character now, more of a foil to Zoro himself, as opposed to just being this alien otherworldly goal that Zoro has to best in order to be proclaimed the best swordsman in the world. Now, based on what we hear about Seraphim and Egghead, this is kind of bolstered because, one, the Seraphim are seen as the strongest form of humanity, and two, it is said that a Delphi user exists in a completely alien reality from the rest of the world, which is true, which means that possibly, S-Hawk would be more fitting to fight Zoro than Mihawk, because in being a Delphi user and being the user of a dice fruit variant, and in being the best swordsman in the world, or at least the copy of the best swordsman in the world, his sword competency is probably leagues and bounds higher, or can become leagues and bounds higher than Mihawk, because not only does he have Mihawk's understanding of the blade, but I think there's something to be said about actually being a blade. So he most likely will accomplish things that Mihawk simply cannot, because the two don't have the same understanding. S-Hawk is living in a completely different world because he literally is what he has competency in, which is a very interesting combination of factors that I don't think we've seen in the story just yet. But with that being said, what's also very interesting about S-Hawk is that I think in Zoro confronting him on Egghead, which is technically S-Hawk's second outing, the first one was against Blackbeard, but I think in confronting Zoro, Zoro has now created his own goal, because I think in fighting S-Hawk now has developed a similar thinking pattern to what Mihawk had developed when fighting Shanks, as to say there's someone out there actually who can stand toe to toe with me, who can possibly best me, or seemingly has the capacity to best me. Therefore, I myself must become more efficient in the blade in order to best them. This gives S-Hawk a goal as well, something that Mihawk doesn't have because he doesn't need one. He's already at the top and he doesn't care about titles. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that S-Hawk doesn't care about titles, because S-Hawk, in being young, now has a set goal presented before him in the form of Zoro, something to aspire to, something to strive to be better than, which most likely Mihawk never really had, or if he had that, he's completely bested that person by now. And then the only person that he would duel no longer is fit to duel him because of his disability. So Mihawk is just kind of out here vibing, whereas S-Hawk is a young, hungry man who now sees that there is a person out there who can actually best him in combat, which I think is going to be a very interesting development for him down the road, because even though he doesn't have the humanity that Mihawk has, he most likely has the drive, the will to become better, to be the best swordsman in the world. You combine that with being told that you're the top of humanity, the strongest form of humanity, and as you know, when someone is the strongest or the best in something, you should not take that lightly when it comes to One Piece. So what is said most likely holds a lot of weight. So keeping that in mind, S-Hawk may have something that he needs to prove, that he needs to strive for, to prove that yes, he is at the top, he is the best swordsman, which may lead him to start thinking more like a conqueror, whereas Mihawk simply doesn't have those thoughts, which would lead him to developing Conqueror's Haki, which we know both of them don't have at this time, because I think, one, Mihawk simply doesn't care about being the king of anything, which is kind of interesting, but that might not be the case for S-Hawk, seeing as how he was challenged for the first time on a very personal level with swordsmanship by Zoro. So now, in order to perhaps compete with Zoro and to best him, he wants to become a conqueror, and therefore he might develop Conqueror's Haki. This then, I think, will lead into sword blackening lore, because it's very likely, not set in stone, but likely that you need Conqueror's Haki in order to make a black blade, which leads me to believe that much like when Zoro was using Susui, a black blade made by Ryuma, Mihawk could be using Yoru, a black blade not necessarily made by him, but maybe somebody else in the past that he fought. With that being said, we also know, based on what Shanks does, I believe, in film Red, that you can actually negate the future sight of observation by combining your observation with Conqueror's Haki. So Conqueror's Haki has the properties to negate the advanced properties of some observation Haki users. With that being said, and given that Conqueror's Haki can affect objects. We see this when Shanks boards Whitebeard's ship and he starts to crack it with his Conqueror's Haki. We do know that Conqueror's Haki can have dominion over objects. It can actually affect them. So with that being said, it would make sense that you would need Conqueror's Haki in order to, I guess, conquer the composition of a weapon permanently, meaning turning it black. So I guess you would be combining Conquerors with armament, which makes a bit of sense if you ask me. So I think S-Hawk is going to get to that point where he can perhaps turn his fake Yoru black, or even perhaps to further note, seeing as how we've seen it before, maybe he can turn his sword limbs permanently black when he generates them. Don't know, but that's something to think about. But with that being said, Zoro will create his own final boss, his own goal, his own dream in pushing S-Hawk forward to become the person who would undoubtedly be the best swordsman in the world. Someone with Conqueror's Haki, with this alien understanding of the blade that he would now have to beat. In beating S-Hawk, he would become the greatest swordsman in the world. And I don't think Dracula Mihawk will have a problem with that, because Dracula Mihawk was a part of Zoro's growth into becoming the swordsman that he would be at that point. And like I said, Dracula Mihawk's role in the story at this point is not to be the world's strongest swordsman, but his point in the story is to develop what Zoro had this entire time, which was a great group of friends who will hold him up and he can put trust in, which is something, from as far as we know, Mihawk has never had, or if he has had it, he's lost it a long time ago. So to regain that now would be Mihawk's ultimate goal. Something in direct opposite to Zoro, because he literally comes in the story with that by joining Luffy. So the two are at two opposite ends of their journey. One will develop the love of family, and the other will achieve the title of greatest swordsman in the world. And seeing as how Mihawk's heart will be filled with the, I guess, the value of camaraderie, he will simply acknowledge Zoro as this, because he can only be prideful and joyous that he helped Zoro get to this point as a former mentor of his. But with that being said, give me your thoughts, like and subscribe, and tell your friends about Polypede Works. Also, Merry Christmas to all. Thank you for being on this journey with me, and I will continue to provide you with the best One Piece content that I can. Thank you so much, and Happy New Year.